I guess it's good morning in Israel. So, shalom. Do you change the greeting based on the time in Israel?
Yeah,
Just
you
always
can say,
shalom.
no, you can say good morning, Boker Tov.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, duly noted. My name is Renaud-Philippe Garner. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia on the Okanagan campus. And today my guest is a distinguished historian, Azar Gat. He completed his doctoral studies at Oxford, and today he's a professor at Tel Aviv University. He's also the Ezer Weitzman Chair for National Security and the founder and head of the Executive Master's Program in Diplomacy and Security. I also want to underline that he's a specialist on war, military strategy, and nationalism. And he's written numerous books worthy of mention, but I will only mention two today. The very excellent War and Human Civilization at Oxford University Press, and Nations, The Long History and Deep Roots of Political Ethnicity and Nationalism at Cambridge University Press, and which is a personal favorite of mine. So Azar, as always, it's an immense pleasure.
Mine as well.
So I'd like to start off with a kind of easy, basic question. I suspect many of my students and many people who aren't in school or in training any kind, they probably have a relatively folkloric or fuzzy view of what war is or what we're talking about when we talk about war. So perhaps you could start by telling us how you define war, or if you don't want to play the definition game, maybe just tell us, well, when you're studying war, how is that different from studying other things?
So it's not an easy question, obviously. It actually touches on very deep questions, and we begin by by stating that we should avoid, this is a philosophy class, so we should avoid reification. Uh, definitions, concepts definitions are conceptual frameworks. We impose them on reality, obviously not arbitrarily, but in order to capture some very meaningful things within reality. But we should never substitute the definitions or the conceptual frameworks from reality itself. So reality is fluid. Just to give you an example, the very word war comes from Old Frankish for discord, strife, something like Hobbes' war. And I've studied the prehistorical fighting. We shall get to it, and it was very, very lethal. Is it war? Is it warfare? Is it fighting? It's a matter of your conceptual, outline. So things change. So, today, I mean, during historical times, war is reserved to large-scale lethal fighting between organized communities. It's as good as it goes. But as I said, some of the most lethal expression of human fighting took place between tribal entities, between individuals, and so forth. So the very distinction between large-scale war and, say, homicide is itself a product of the emergence of states. Basically, what I'm saying is that there are three basic types of human interaction. One is cooperation. People do it a lot. Another is non-violent competition. And the third is violent competition. And what I'm concerned with is the various expression of violent competition, which, in some of its historical expression is known as war. So I wouldn't
So
bother too much. I wouldn't bother too much with the definition. It's enough that people get killed.
okay, well, I think that's very helpful. And I want to follow up on something you said. You repeated a few times, actually, that some of these very ancient conflicts, prehistoric, were very lethal. Could you just maybe spell that out for someone who might be puzzled by that claim?
Okay, so here again, philosophy. So we have two rival views of what the state of nature was, which every philosophy student is familiar with. One is Rousseau's. That is, the state of nature was peaceful. People were scattered across the countryside. They had all their needs provided by nature, richly provided by nature. There was no reason for fighting, and so on. So this is the state of nature according to Rousseau. On the other hand, we have an equally famous view expressed a century before Rousseau by Thomas Hobbes, which is that it's the war of every man against every man. In the absence of central authority that can mediate, that can impose peace, every conflict between people can easily escalate into a bloody conflict. Now, these are the two basic views. I shall add that when you teach it in philosophy, I guess, present company excluded, it's usually presented as an hypothetical question. It does not describe the actual historical condition, but an intellectual exercise as to the absence of state authority. Now, this is not the case. This is not what Hobbes and Rousseau themselves meant. They lived in the European age of exploration, which brought Europeans in contact with a great variety of society across the world. It really excited the European imagination, and these questions for them were not hypothetical. But let's leave Rousseau and Hobbes aside. These questions are clearly empirical. The transition to agriculture only took place in the most pioneering societies only about 10,000 years ago. The rise of the earliest states emerged some 5,000 years ago in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So, but our species is between 200 and 300,000 years old. So 95 to 99% of our history as a species was spent as hunter-gatherers in the so-called state of nature, before agriculture, before the state. So it's an empirical question whether or not people in the state of nature fought. And anthropologists have been debating this for 2 centuries. Very difficult to get to the answer because you do not have these hunter-gatherer societies do not have records. So you need people from state civilization to document them. And the question is if contact with them does not change them. It's like the quantum mechanics. The very act of observation changes the object. And not to leave the impression that I understand anything about quantum mechanics, it's like asking whether or not the light in the refrigerator turns off when we close the door. How do you find out? How do you find out what the answer to this is? So the question remained open. I think in the last few decades, it has become clear that the state of nature was very, very bloody. Bloodier than the most severe of state civilization, of wars by state civilization.
So when you say bloodier, I take it that what you're saying is that the percentage of casualties were very high, since obviously the absolute numbers of populations were quite low.
That's right. So about 25% of the men died violently. All the rest were covered with scars. About 15% of the population. So this is you only reach such high percentage in the most severe of state wars. whereas this was pretty much the norm among pre-state and pre-agricultural societies.
Okay, so now we have this picture that we're perhaps not these angelic creatures corrupted by the state and society in the very recent human past. So that seems like one perhaps misconception we could have. And Nietzsche said that convictions are greater enemies of truth than lies. And by that he meant that if you're really convinced of something, you won't look for truth because you already think you know it. And you don't need to be in the business of manipulating and deceiving people. So aside from the Husserlist myth, what kind of bad convictions or false beliefs do you find you encounter the most when you talk to people about war?
So the Russian myth is obviously very central, but if you want others, so rather than myth, I'll talk about puzzles. People are puzzled by the question, why war? And there are two main views about this. One is that, to quote the general and philosopher of war, Prussian, lived in the early 19th century, said that war was a means to an end. We are familiar with his saying that war is a continuation of state policy by other means. So we want something, we use force to get it. It's clear what the logic, the utilitarian logic behind it is. But at the same time, we have an opposite view of why war, which is shocked by its cost. It seems that the sides pay far more than any gain that they can get. That the cost in terms of destruction of wasted resources of human life are so high. And so people have always been shocked by its absurdity. During in traditional societies, it was used to be regarded as a curse from heaven, together with pestilence and famine and all that, others horses of the apocalypse. In a more modern version, it's regarded as some kind of, perhaps people are locked into some kind of prisoner's dilemma. So we have these two opposing views of what the cause of war is. And I think that any explanation would need to take account of both views and to incorporate both views. And this is what I've tried to do in my work. It's too complicated to go into it now, but basically, historically, the cause of conflict was fundamental scarcity. Maybe the fundamental logic of all this was formulated by Thomas Malthus, who suggested that people always live in pre-modern societies. He wrote in 1799, so it was just the end. He didn't realize this, but this was right at the very end of pre-modernity. That people in all societies live on the brink of subsistence, and it can easily fall under it by any cause. And any increase in production is being swallowed up by demographic growth. So the picture is gloomy. It's the abysmal science, as it was known. And so possession of resources was basically a zero-sum game. And you could only increase your share of it by taking from others, whether others from your own society or from other societies. Now, this logic has one more sentence. This logic has changed with industrialization, with the exponential growth in wealth, which changed the entire logic of war. As maybe we shall have the opportunity to talk about that too.
So that's, I think, very helpful. And I suppose that in some way, maybe for many people who don't read a lot of history, it's hard for them to imagine for how long human history poverty was the absolute norm, even for the elites to some degree, and how odd and unrepresentative our contemporary wealth is. I think maybe for a lot of people that's hard to grasp.
Right.
And so they don't realize just how much the competition how it was before.
You don't want to be a king, the king of England or France or the emperor of China in pre-modern times. Just think about the most basic things, glasses, bad teeth, skin disease, and I'm not talking about anything more serious.
We'll leave the rest to the imagination.
All right.
So one question I want to ask, and then I hope we can return to the causes of war and the way war has changed, and particularly turn to maybe peace too, is uh, topics that we enjoy discussing benefit from this kind of special burden. So if you or I were chemists and we were on a bus or sitting at a cafe and people asked us what kind of scholarship we do, and we did really hardcore organic chemistry, very quickly our fellow citizens or coffee goers would get bored. But if we tell them, well, I write about war sometimes, people want to talk. They want to talk right away. And public debate about war seems to be, quite animated, a lot more than tax policy. So what do you think citizens need to know or how they should go about discussing war? You obviously do it for a living, but, when you observe this, what do you think is often lacking?
I don't know the answer to this. People interest in most subject is obviously limited because they cannot really delve into it. Intellectuals do it for a living, but I don't trust intellectuals much. I will get to this. I expect later on. Look, there is, for example, today the question of whether or not war is declining, or this this has been the view since the end of the Cold War. Now many feel that this was a preposterous idea, given the war in Ukraine and the rising tensions in around China, and obviously the wars in my region, my part of the world, and all that. So people are very preoccupied with this question, and they do not. If you want me to elaborate a bit, so they do not notice the most glaring fact about all this, which is that the developed world, the developed countries, we shall define them as having production per capita over $20,000 from non-energy, from non-oil and gas resources, because this is not a sign of development, just of having the good fortune of living just over an oil well. In all the developed parts of the world, war has completely disappeared. There are no more wars between countries. There are no more civil wars. There is no longer the fear of war in any of them. So, for example, you are in Canada now, so I'll ask, why is it that Canada does not at all fear an American conquest? Why not? I remember that during the 19th century, Americans felt that Canada should be part of. Yeah, obviously, in Canada, they feel the American cultural invasion, but not a military invasion. In Western Europe, why is it that Belgium and Holland do not at the least fear a German or a French invasion against all of history? Why doesn't it occur to Germany or France to invade any of these countries? And in the same way, in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even though there are no love wasted between them because of Japan's colonial past, they do not fear war between them at all. But they fear China and North Korea. And in the same way, the peace between New Zealand and Australia looks so obvious that as if it does not require any explanation. So this is against the entire course of history, and people do not notice it in the least. The world today is divided into two. One is the developed parts, in which absolute peace prevails within the developed world. As I said, no interstate war, no civil war, no fear of war. And then the less or least developed parts of the world, which are zones of war, either actual or expected. This is how Thomas Hobbes defined the state of war, that war is always expected, or
Yes.
might occur. So, for example, this is what people miss in interpreting the world of today.
Yes, I think this is a very important point that you make, is that when people sometimes discuss these complicated and broad phenomena, you might say things like, war or even poverty or disease, sometimes they speak about it as if they're equally distributed or the same frequency everywhere. But part of what you're pointing out is that only a few generations ago, all of our ancestors in the West had some recent memory of being mobilized to go fight some neighbor, and this will become increasingly so as you go back to the historical records. And today, as you point out, when we talk about the War of 1812 in Canada, it's a distant memory. There are some quaint museums and monuments, but no one seriously ever thinks, well, we need weapons because we need to stop the Yanks from coming over the border. That's
People in the developed world still go to war, but they go to war only in the less developed parts of the world because of, I can disclose, because of threats that come from these parts of the world.
Right. So the illusion that war is still going on is they're failing to distinguish between the large wars, say, fought between France and Germany, and the fact that France sends troops to the Sahel or something like that, or the Central African Republic.
Right. The distinction here, the failure to distinguish, is between the developed and the less developed parts of the non-developed parts of the world, which shows us something about the trajectory. One would, first of all, we see that the developed parts of the world have moved away from war, and it gives us also some expectation that as other parts of the world develop, they might enter the same category. They might enter they might embrace the same logic.
So I want to press you a little bit to spell out what you mean when you say develop, and why you have this asterisks or parentheses to exclude those who have their riches from resource extraction, because for many students who might not have done a lot of economics or political science, they might just think, well, money, develop means rich. So could you spell out for them what exactly you're getting at?
So develop involves many other things. It involves basically, because it goes together with an advanced economy. So we are talking about basically urban society with people with a large middle class, which is well off and educated. And first of all, there are not many oil-rich societies that have over $20,000 per capita, but some of them have, still stick to traditional ways of life, sometimes values. Even they are not that much involved in war with other rich countries.
So, so when you're talking about the way that these this anomaly, this historical anomaly, where up until very recently, almost all societies were permanently recovering from the last war, preparing for the next war. They often fought with their neighbors. This sense that they could just simply stop worrying that the neighbor would invade would be basically a fantasy. It's Thomas More's utopia, but trying to explain to a 17th century Spaniard or an Aztec in the 13th century. It made no sense. But so your explanation seems to draw a lot on this idea that, look, there are material conditions that make peace possible. But there are other competing theories, aren't there? They're trying to explain why the world is less violent. Would you want to maybe share one of those and tell us why we should favor a more
Sure.
material explanation?
Sure. So let's first stick with the material explanation, and that is that, we live under the shadow of the bomb. Since 1945, we have nuclear weapons, and since nuclear weapons are governed by the logic of MAD, mutual assured destruction, nobody actually wants to commit suicide. So when we talk about what political scientists call the long peace, the long peace between the great powers since 1945, you don't have to be an Einstein to figure out that they haven't fought each other because of the nuclear factor. However, what people miss is that we have seen the sharp decline of war during the 19th century. The second longest period of peace between the great powers took place between 1871, that is the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and World War I, 1914. So this is 43 years of no peace, of no war between the great powers, even though Germany just won 3 spectacular wars, which brought it a rich reward, and still it didn't fight for another 43 years. And the third longest peace ever between the great powers took place between 1815 and 1854. That is between the end of the Napoleonic War and the Crimean War. This is 39 years. It's generally known that the 19th century was the most peaceful in history until then. So this raises many questions. One of them, perhaps the long peace. So both periods of long peace in the 19th century took place before the nuclear factor. So it's not the nuclear factor that is responsible for the peace. Maybe the long peace phenomenon was not something new. Maybe it took place earlier in history. Again, the answer is negative. If you look at any earlier history, you see, as you said, war occurring all the time. What then is the reason? Perhaps we should get to this in a moment before presenting other options for why war has declined, if indeed it has. One of them is that there's been an ideological change. All right. People forget, however, that the most prominent ideologies in world history, including Christianity in its original form, and also later in its doctrine, which was very different from its practice, preached obviously peace, absolutely. And the same applies to the great ideologies of East Asia, to Buddhism, to Confucianism. All of them were deeply pacifistic. And in none of these places did peace prevail. On the contrary. So there was a sharp clash between ideology, people's pious state of mind, and the reality of existence, which was very, very warlike. Another the explanation that has been offered is that what we see is a democratic peace. Apparently, democracies are peaceful. And therefore, what we actually see is the lack of war between democracies. And since today, all of the developed countries are democracies, one may ask, why? How do we know that it's the fact of development rather than democracy? So there are several tests for us that make it possible to distinguish between the two. One is that pre-modern democracies fought each other. It applies to classical Greece and to ancient Italy and to the city-states of Renaissance Italy. So democracies in pre-modern time fought each other. Second, non-democratic countries in modern times have fought much less than previously. Just to give you an example, Prussia during the 18th century fought in 1 year in each 3. Austria fought 1 in 2 because it had also the Ottoman Empire on its other side. Both of them fought in a very few years between 1815 and 1914. So the decline was huge during the 90s, also for non-democracies. Both Austria and Prussia were not democracies. The third thing, the third thing that will help us distinguish is the fact that democracy itself, on a large country scale, was an innovation of modern times. To that also people do not pay sufficient attention. Democracy in pre-modern times was always confined to city-states or at best to canton sides. And it's the phenomenon of large state country-sized democracies only begins with the United States and then spreads during the 19th and early 20th century, or during the 20th century. So democracy itself is the product of modernization, of industrial modernization. I could elaborate on that, but let's leave it aside. And finally, people mention trade interdependence as the reason for the peace, and they forget that trade independence is also a function of industrial societies. Before industrial times, the producers, mainly peasants, 80% of the population of the world, basically consumed whatever they produced, and only the extra they sold in the marketplace. However, with industrial society, nobody consumes what it produces. This includes me and you, which is a bit difficult, tricky to say what is it exactly that we produce. But in any case, we get paid for it. So nobody consumes what it produces. So the market interdependence itself rides on the process of industrial modernization with its global division of labor and all the specialization and all that. So any other competing explanation that you would want me to?
Not really. I think that was very exhaustive. I just want to come back on some of it because I think it'd be helpful for some listeners to think in terms of, part of what you're pointing out here when you're teasing out what really is doing the work. If you think you might have more than one feature present, what's doing the work? Part of what you showed is that very often the other competing are neither necessary nor sufficient. So when you say, for example, that even non-democratic states, authoritarian, monarchical, but non-democratic states, if they too undergo a peaceful transition or a decline in war, then clearly democracy can't be a necessary condition. It might be sufficient, but it's certainly not necessary. And so,
it's not sufficient
no, it's not.
either.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to point out that for
we remember pre-modern democracies.
Yes, so Athens liked to go to war. Athens was far more aggressive than Sparta, which people forget. Spartans
and it fought other democracies.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Being a Democrat, it doesn't mean you respect other Democrats that much. So I also think that one of the points that you made that was fantastic and that really bears repeating is that when we examine some of the discourse or the explicit values of many of these societies, you'll find many claims that are very old, but sometimes we get told are new things we should try. So when we hear something about the cosmopolitan ethos, but a lot of these views, religious ones in particular, had a cosmopolitan outlook, whether it's Christianity or any of the Eastern religions. They at least had universal pretension. Like you say, they often present themselves as being in favor of peace, or tranquility or wisdom. They rarely exalt war as the greatest activity. So I think it's very important to remind ourselves of these things. I think it was you who liked to quote, was it Lenin said something like, "Don't listen to what political parties say, look at what they do." And so
Yes.
you might say here it's another case of, okay, you've got priests and lawyers and other people talking about value, and then you can say, okay, do they live up to any of that?
No, I must, yes, sure. But I must say that I do not doubt the sincerity, at least of the founders of these, of this system, spiritual system. So I grant Jesus or the Buddha himself or Confucius for truly believing in all this. All right, it's not, and then you have, the bureaucracies, vested interests, establishment, the religious establishments, all the things that we are all too familiar with.
Right. So we have something like 12 people and then everybody else. Uh,
Well,
so,
maybe.
um, so I'd like to ask though, in coming to view, in searching for what is the best explanation for these three pieces that you identified, the long piece from 45 on, the piece from 1871 to 1914, the piece from 1815 to 1854. Is there a particular author or school of thought that, helped you maybe overcome certain beliefs you held or certain, assumptions you had or something to that effect?
So I'm trying to be modest, but
There's no need. This is not a requirement.
no. But when I, embarked on this quest to find the answer to the most fundamental questions regarding war, which people obviously, since they've been with us, since the beginning of history, people have doubted and still doubt that they have a definitive answer. So the questions of why war, the question of since when have people been fighting, the question of what changes in war have been brought by the transition to agriculture, the rise of states, the beginning of modernity. When I tried to find the answer to all this, I had to explore myself. And obviously, I consulted a huge amount of literature on various societies and various periods around the globe, obviously. But I had to come with the answers myself, which I incorporated into the book that you mentioned, War in Human History, in Human Civilization, sorry. So obviously bits and pieces everywhere. What I really found as a revelation at the time was the logic of evolutionary theory for explaining basic human motivation and all that. I remember reading for the first time Dawkins, the Selfish Gene and other books, and how struck I was, not only with the ideas, but with how ignorant I had been before reading these books. So I've since immersed myself quite extensively into this literature and applied it to various questions regarding human evolution and including human historical evolution.
Well, that almost sounded modest, so I don't think you need to worry.
I made an effort.
So it seems like part of what you've argued, and I think rather convincingly, is that the most important historical shift is about the decline in frequency and distribution of war. So before, war was constant, and it was basically everywhere. Maybe not everywhere at any one point in time, but there was really no safe place from war, and no generation was safe, is basically what you're saying. But today, part of what you're picking out is that there are places that are safe for war, or to the extent they're not safe, it's because they're engaging with those other war-torn zones. So that seems like that's the great historical change. And this is where I want to bring up historical change and historical continuity, which is sometimes it seems like when we listen to people talk about war, and not just commentators on TV, but even people with degrees and apparently educated people, sometimes we hear something like war never changes. And then we also hear everything has changed. Look at the drones. Robots are coming next. Terminator. And so it seems like we get these two views that sometimes can be hard to reconcile. So we've already identified one, what I get that you think is the greatest change is this drop in frequency of war and distribution. What would you think is another important discontinuity, to the extent you think there's another one that's even comparable?
So first, there is this question of continuity versus change, and again, I must point out that these are categories of human perception. We look for continuity, we look for change, and we try to see. So we need to guard against becoming captive of our own categories of thought. Nothing in the world is the same as any other thing. You don't need to quote Heraclitus for that. But things are sufficiently similar in order to be able to group them together. No war is similar to any other war, obviously. Do you hear me all right now?
Yeah. So there was a brief breakdown in the quality of the connection. But from what I gathered, you were pointing out to us, first of all, not to become blinded by our own categories, and that all these things that we're comparing, there must be sufficient similarity to group them together. Otherwise, why would you even talk about them in the same breath?
Exactly.
But we must not become blinded to the fact that they remain fundamentally different.
They remain sufficiently different, right? Because
right.
Yeah. So people are captivated by the idea of essence.
Mm-hmm.
What is the essence of the phenomenon? We won't get back to all these medieval arguments between nominalism and rationalism and all that. But there is no essence. There is similarity, which if there is an essence, then it's an essence attributed by our mind. Again, not a strange concept to the history of philosophy. So for example, as I said, I've just finished a book on what people regarded as the theory of war. And until modern times, it seemed very simple. I mean, history, you find an example with Machiavelli. Machiavelli believed, like the ancients, that the world that does not change, that it's just, some rotation of fairly familiar phenomena, the cycle of regime, other things, which are cyclical. It doesn't really change. So, for example, for this reason, he rejected the significance of firearms, which were beginning to appear during his own time. And this is such a failure, but by such a shrewd observer. And people have been trying to explain it by many ways. For example, that firearms contradicted the virtue and all that. But they failed to see what the fundamental problem really was, and that is that he didn't recognize change, historical change. So he equated guns to ancient engines of siege, or to bows and arrows and slingers, but didn't understand that this was going to revolutionize war.
Yes.
But hold on. But
Yes.
since then, people have been accustomed to change because there was change. He didn't recognize change because he didn't see in his historical, span in the historical span with which he was familiar. There was very little change. So especially since the beginning of the industrial times, a new concept has been introduced. And now people talk about doctrines of armored warfare, doctrines of air warfare. This was not applied. This was not applied to military theory before industrial times. It was coined, has been coined unwittingly to cope with change, because armored warfare comes and goes, air warfare comes and goes. So the concept of doctrine has been introduced in order to bridge between what people now still define as the eternal principles of war, which have been reduced to a few very abstract sentences and sometimes competing, self-contradictory and all that, and the actual reality of war, which people now sense is being changed by constant, mainly technologically induced changes.
Yes, I find that
if you
very...
want, no, I'm saying, so if you want definitions, yes, it's still collectives fighting each other, and then in the lethal, the clash of forces. Definition remains. Very little except for this is still useful.
No, I think that was very helpful. And in particular, because what you're talking about with Machiavelli, you wrote in an article, I think, from the late 80s, where you point this out. And I think, it's an interesting, because you might think there's, two kind of biases where some people see change everywhere, other people see constancy everywhere. So, when you read Machiavelli, every time he makes an argument, he just will list examples from all across human history, tons of antiquity, tons of contemporary. And for a lot of contemporary political scientists, they'd say, these are crazy comparisons, they're all different. But they're not crazy if you think there is no fundamental change. An aristocratic regime in 13th century Italy is just like an ancient one in Greece. And similarly, if you're obsessed with change, you're going to forget why someone like Norman Schwarzkopf studies Hannibal and says, nothing has changed, I still study the Battle of Cannae. Well, the late Schwarzkopf, but anyhow. So I think, so it seems like it's, as you've been, want to point out in the past, that this kind of blindness is because of our framework. You're looking for something, and you see what you're looking for. So I want to talk about, in that case, okay, so we had a little bit of on the continuity, but maybe do you want to say a bit more about, what do you mean exactly by doctrine? So if I'm an undergraduate student and I know, okay, there's armored warfare, I think that means tanks. Okay, I think air warfare starts in the early 20th century. But what's this doctrine? Maybe they've heard it in religion, but what is exactly military doctrine, and how is that, different from the past?
So doctrine means what if you take take armored warfare, for example, okay, the doctrine. So if you take the various cases of armored warfare and look at their feature and try to determine if you abstract from very particular circumstances, what can you say about armored warfare in general? So obviously, for example, it's very mobile. It's far more mobile than foot walking infantry before mechanization. So you expect it, for example, to move at the pace of dozens of kilometers per day. You expect it to be very mobile, to serve tactical and operational maneuvering. You already know that it has that you know in what kind of terrain it's most profitable to employ mechanized formation. So you want, for example, to be flat, to be open to movement and all that. This can be, deduced from the features of the, but also from experience. You have enough cases from which you try to extract lessons, and these are empirical lessons presented in abstract form.
So then someone says, well, look, okay, I think I get a better understanding, Azar. So doctrine is basically a kind of systematic view. I say, okay, armored warfare maybe follows principles. If I study enough cases and extract away the silly features, like what color is the paint on the vehicle? Is there a way of serving tea in British tanks versus French tanks? But then someone could say, well, okay, so there's a military science. There's a kind of way of moving from individual cases to general principles. Why don't we just get the best doctrine? Where's the problem with that?
So we do have the best doctrine for armored warfare, but it applies to armored warfare. It doesn't apply to air warfare. It doesn't apply to to the doctrines of how to employ paratroopers or naval warfare. The features of the phenomenon on which we focus are different. So obviously you can draw lines of similarity. This is what the most abstract principles, so-called principles of war do. So you want you want to hold the initiative, you want to act aggressively, you want mobility, you want concentration of force, but for every such principle you also have the opposite. So it has its basic educational value because you have to train soldiers and commanders and all that. So it gets them into the right mood. How to apply things in the actual world obviously demands a lot of knowledge about the real world, and the real world changes. That's the point. For example, armored warfare was something introduced during the early 20th century, and maybe reached its peak during World War II. So it historically it is confined to a particular form of warfare during a particular time. The same with all the others. Okay, so for the ancients, for example, the art of war was, how you employed the phalanx in Greece, or how you best employed the legion in Rome. Okay, or how do you best employ the mounted archer if you belong to the people of the steppe? This was basically the art of war for them, and for a very good reason. And it also looked very stable. Machiavelli could still go back to the ancients and advocate something that was between the Roman legion and the Macedonian phalanx, which he rightly identified with the Swiss hedgehog of pikes, similar to the Macedonian phalanx of his own time, and to some forms of Spanish warfare, which he thought was a bit similar to the legionary practices. Because the technological and therefore much of the social and political background were quite similar, not much change. It only took 1 century later for Francis Bacon to say that the world has changed completely, because we have 3 things that the ancients did not know: printing technology, a navigation of the oceans, and gunfire. And there was this debate during the 17th century between the modern and the ancients. Until then, it was always clear that the best model were in the past. The ancients were well, the model to emulate. We never reached the level of Greek philosophy. We never reached the perfection of the Roman Republic. And now the notion that the present is superior to the past begins in the 17th century and obviously develops during the 18th century with the idea of progress, which was something entirely new, the idea of progress. Never occurring before. Why? Because people realized that we have come, you know, we have traveled some road since ancient times.
I think what you just said is both obviously very true in the telling of the historical facts, but I think it also raises a very important point that might help explain why so many people will get things wrong about war, which is part of what you're pointing out is a theory of mind, right? So when you're talking about people who could not even imagine progress or that anyone believed in it, they'd have a hard time understanding any such worldview or any such ambition or even the interest. Why would you want to do better or do differently? We already have the best model. And so it seems to me certainly that sometimes these debates, part of what is unfortunate is it seems like some of the parties, debates within a society or between societies, is they have a very hard time imagining that someone could think differently from them. They really just think it's my view and mistakes. And I think that this is surely part of the problem when we hear things like, well, they can't really mean that, therefore they must be just lying or it's just propaganda, because no one could believe that. You know, that in italics, underlined, bolded. And I think that there's something very interesting about that in the way in which I think maybe a lot of contemporaries are of two minds. Both there's a certain kind of nostalgia and a certain kind of sense that well, contemporary world is just better than the past. And I think that there's a maybe both a blindness, but also kind of inconsistency. A sense that things are better, but they're not quite what we're promised, I think might be a way of putting it.
Yeah.
So look, as I have found this very helpful, and I'm sure that my students and other students will find it very helpful. Any concluding thoughts for the end of this interview? Maybe first of two, but is any final thoughts or corrections besides we need to avoid reification and philosophers need to stop obsessing over essence?
Well, we didn't explain why war has declined since 1800, but you know, maybe we leave it, you know, for another talk, or let's send people to, you know, to read the books. Otherwise, I think we have had quite enough of thoughts for such a short hour. No.
I think it's a lot for an hour, and I'd happily come back to the explanation of decline. And also, I think what particularly I find interesting is the different theories predict different stability of decline. And I think the view you favor is the least fairy tale-like. The conditions you describe are not necessarily eternal or represent some sort of unilateral direction we can't ever come back from. So you're no Alexander Wendt. So well, Azar, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you a lot for your time and your insights. And I hope to, in a few weeks' time, come back to you with a list of questions from my students.
Thank you for having me, and I'll be delighted to answer any question that your students might have.
Thank you.